All right. Cheater sourdough. All right, so this is a bread machine recipe that I modified from the Pantry Mama's, I forget what she calls it, but it's basically like a discard sourdough sandwich bread recipe that she has. And I think that her recipes are really good, but I had to modify this one a little bit because of the bread machine. Okay, so this is how I do it. Grams. All right, so I do everything by weight again because it's easier for me, and everything in my recipe is written in order of adding it. So 200 grams of water. And this is actually the bread machine pan that goes right in the machine. And the machine that I got was on Facebook Marketplace, and I think it was $25 or something. It was a student that was moving out of MSU. Okay, 201. Ooh, 200 right on the dot. Okay, water. 100 grams of starter discard or fed. So I'm actually probably not gonna bake because I won't have time anymore, like real sourdough bread. So I'm gonna use, you can actually see that it did double and now it's flat, right? So it's active, like there's still a live yeast in there, but it's not like at their peak, like we're hungry phase. So it's not like ideal to use right now to do long sourdough, like real sourdough bread, but you still could if you wanted. Like this, I just fed it last night. I went to bed, woke up, it doubled and everything. So I would be fine to use it now if I wanted to. I just know I'm not tomorrow gonna have time to like monitor sourdough, which is basically one thing that I learned in this process is you really do have to watch your bread, and it has to be the dough. It has to be when it's ready to do it. If you try to rush it, ain't gonna happen. And I've never had it go faster than I'd like. It usually goes slower than I want because, again, my house is cold. So unless you cook in the summer, maybe, I just don't do it very often. All right, so then 100 grams of starter. And like I said, I am using active starter, fed starter, I guess you'd say. All right, I think it's about a half a cup that ends up being. All right, so the good thing about having a starter is if you think about it, and if you do your starter where it's 1 to 1, then you have basically 1 to 1 flour and water all the time in a jar. So if there's a recipe where you want it to have like a tangy flavor, or like you like that sourdough and sometimes it just like makes it more moist, to use starter, because the flour is really hydrated in a starter, you basically can use part of your starter in any recipe where it would call for flour and water. You would just, figure out the grams. The recipe it's better in grams. So it's like even parts, right? So you can do any recipe, and that's actually kind of what I did with this recipe. All right, so then we're gonna do 40 grams of olive oil. And again, it doesn't need to be perfect, just like with feeding your starter. It's all about just kind of roundabouts are fine. All right, 41 grams. Oh shit. And 20 grams of honey. In the honey, you can put a little more or a little less if you like it sweeter or whatever. I feel like the 20 tends to be pretty good for me. Honey's always fun to measure. All right, This one I cannot do lotion. All right, 200 grams of all-purpose flour. All right, so is it 200? No, 400 grams. I don't remember if I said it right. All right, 400 grams all-purpose flour. Coming right up. I had to go buy flour today, and I actually looked at something that I had never seen before in the ingredients of this all-purpose flour that I use. It says enzymes. I kind of wonder what that is. So I started to Google it a little bit. It sounds like it's like an amylase, which is an enzyme that helps break down and digest protein. And it talks about how, 400, yeah. It talks about how, online it talked about that the enzymes help to do something with the yeast, which I thought was interesting because I don't feel like you'd want like amylase because it might break down the gluten, which you want gluten for bread to have this texture. But I have to read more about it. I don't understand where the enzymes come from. Are they added to the flour? Is it something that's kind of naturally there and just listed on the label? I don't know. I'll let you know when I find out. It's a lot more than I always think. Ooh, I went over 415. This should be okay. The good thing about putting in your bread machine in this order is like the dry really stays right on the top. It doesn't sink into the water until it starts mixing, which is nice when you're delaying the start of a loaf, because I set the timer on my bread machine to like, I might put it tonight and then like have it actually start baking in the middle of the night. So then in the morning, my bread is like hot for breakfast. So when you put a bread machine bread together, you want it to be in kind of the liquid first, then the flour, and then on top of the flour is the yeast and the salt and stuff, because you don't want the yeast to start being active, and the yeast doesn't get active until it touches the moisture. So that's why. Okay, here's my recipe. 400 grams all-purpose flour, 50 grams rye flour. Again, this is like my recipe that I came up with. If I wanted it more rye, I could do less all-purpose and more rye, but I feel like rye is a very soft flour. So when the bread, like it wouldn't have very great, it doesn't have a lot of good structure with just rye. So the all-purpose helps. 50. Great, 50. And then I have this little bit of bread flour that I use in it because I basically don't have anything else to use bread flour for. I've tried to make loaves with it. A lot of bread flour to me is not good in the loaf. So I just kind of am using it up basically. So I did 50 grams of bread flour in this bread machine cheater loaf. I didn't clear it, but I need 100 then. All right. A little bit more. All right. Flour's all in there. And then just the salt and the yeast is left. It's really nice to measure your salt, especially with grams, because I don't know if you ever have made a recipe where it called for like table salt or kosher salt, and you actually, if you, it says calls for kosher salt and you use table salt in the same volume, it'll be really salty because of the grain. So in like a teaspoon of something that's really fat grained, like think of like sidewalk salt, a teaspoon of sidewalk salt, you might get like 1 or 2 crumbs of salt, right? But a teaspoon of table salt is very fine, so you'll get a lot more in grams. So weighing your salt in grams, and a lot of those ingredients, I mean, in general, it's more accurate, but it's always interesting to me how recipes will say 1 teaspoon of salt, and you're like, well, which salt? This is 10 grams. Sometimes I do a little bit more if I want. I tend to like saltier foods, but okay, that's 12 grams. And then 7 grams of yeast. And I make a little well in the flour. I can show you kind of what it looks like here. So I poke like a little hole so it can hold the yeast. And I don't know if that's necessary. I've seen people do it with other bread machine recipes. And it seems to make sense to me, just so the yeast, again, doesn't start to activate. Now you can just do like a 1 packet of this active bread machine yeast, or 1 packet is 2 1/4 teaspoons. And you know, I've noticed on my bread machine used to be sensitive, or not my bread machine, my scale used to be totally fine with this, but on the last couple of loaves, I'm like pouring the yeast in, and it's just so light, and I'm wondering if it's not being accurate. So for this, I'm gonna actually measure out that 2 1/4 teaspoons with measuring spoons, just because of that thing I've noticed with it not picking up the weight. So that's 1/4, and so that says 1 gram. Let's see, two more teaspoons. And that actually did measure it. That's 10 grams. So that's interesting. I don't know, maybe I just felt like I was pouring a lot, but maybe it wasn't as much as I thought the last couple times. All right. So, all right, we got our water, starter, oil, honey, flour, different 3 flours, salt, and yeast. And then I'm just gonna go put it in my bread machine and time it so that in the morning when I wake up, the bread is ready to go. All right, thanks for watching.